my name is Christina Wiegand and I am South Atlantic Fishery Management Council staff, and today I'm going to be giving you a scoping overview for Snapper Grouper Regulatory Amendment 29, which addresses best fishing practices and powerheads. So first things first, what is scoping? Well, scoping is the very first stage in the process to amend a fishery management plan after an issue has been identified, and it really serves two main purposes. First, to inform you that the Council may propose new regulations or change existing ones, and to allow you the opportunity to comment on the issue or identify any other issues that may need the attention of the Council. And there will be additional opportunities to comment as we go through developing this amendment, but scoping is really the first and the best opportunity to make suggestions before an amendment has been developed. So why is the South Atlantic Council considering action? Well, commercial and recreational fishermen have expressed concern about regulations that result in released fish that don't survive. And a portion of released fish will die due to foul hooking, injuries caused by barotrauma, predation, a variety of things. And so to reduce the number of released fish and improve the survivorship of fish that are released, the Council is considering best fishing practices as either mandatory or voluntary options. And these best fishing practices will include both fishing techniques and gear that minimize the impact of capture and look to release fish with minimal handling and time out of the water. Additionally, fishermen have expressed some concern about inequitable access for the dive component of the snapper grouper fishery. Powerheads, sometimes called bang sticks, are prohibited in federal waters off South Carolina. So to allow for more consistent regulations for the dive component of the snapper grouper fishery, the Council is considering removing the powerhead prohibition in federal waters off South Carolina. Or alternatively, they could consider prohibiting powerheads in the EEZ throughout the South Atlantic. So what is barotrauma and why does it happen? Well, most marine fishes have a gas-filled organ that's known as a swim bladder. And this swim bladder allows the fish to control its buoyancy as well as its location within the water column. Now, barotrauma, a condition that's often experienced by snapper grouper species, occurs when a fish is rapidly reeled up from depth. And the change in pressure causes the fish's swim bladder to expand and in some cases burst, which will cause air to fill the body cavity. And along with causing internal damage, this expansion can prevent the fish from swimming back down to the capture depth, which is why they're sometimes called floaters. And this decreases the fish's chances of survival and makes it more vulnerable to predators. Now, fish that are experiencing barotrauma exhibit some clearly identifiable signs, and these include bulging eyes, swollen abdomen, or the stomach and intestines protruding from the mouth. Now, not all species are going to react the same way to barotrauma, but if a fish is experiencing any of these symptoms, it will likely need some help descending back down to the capture depth. Now, onto what this amendment is about. There are best fishing practices that can help reduce the number of released fish as well as improve the survivorship of released fish. Standard practice to improve survivorship is to reduce handling and the amount of time a fish is going to be out of the water. However, a fish experiencing barotrauma may not survive without some assistance. And there are two types of tools that can be used to treat barotrauma. The first type of tool are venting devices, and these are sharp, hollow tools that can be used to release gases that have overexpanded due to barotrauma. And once those gases have been released, organs can return to their original positions and the fish should be able to swim back down. When venting, fishermen should hold the fish on its side firmly and insert the venting tool at a 45-degree angle. And it should be inserted into the fish approximately 1 to 2 inches behind the base of the pectoral fin. And it should be inserted only deep enough to release the gases. And it's important to note that instruments that are not hollow, things like fishing hooks or knives, are not appropriate for venting a fish and will cause more harm. The second type of device are descending tools, and these are tools that are able to quickly send a fish back to the depth where it was caught. And rapidly sending the fish back down to depth will cause the gases in the swim bladder to recompress, which again should allow the fish to swim away. Now, descending devices can be purchased or made by hand, but they're generally some kind of weighted device that's going to be attached to fishing line or rope and that has a clamp or a hook to attach to the mouth of the fish. Next on the list, we've got circle hooks, and these are a type of fishing hook designed such that the point is going to turn back towards the shank, creating this circle or oval shape. These are typically used with natural baits, and the perk of circle hooks is that they're more likely to hook a fish in the mouth because the circular shape is going to allow the hook to move towards the jaw without catching on the fish's gut or throat. Furthermore, non-offset or inline circle hooks, and these are hooks where the point is turned back perpendicular to the shank, are less likely to injure a fish. Offset circle hooks, on the other hand, are less ideal, and these are more likely to result in the hook catching before the fish's jaw and lodging in the gills or the gut. Now, in addition to avoiding internal damage, fish that end up being hooked in the mouth are going to be easier to dehook, which is going to decrease the amount of time the fish is being handled. And since circle hooks will set as you reel in the line, they're going to be great for inexperienced anglers as well as bottom fishing. And last but not least, there's the use of single hook rigs, and the idea behind this is simply to reduce the number of fish that may need to be discarded. Alright, so now we're going to get into the different actions that are being considered in this amendment. The first looks at specifying requirements for the use of descending devices and/or venting devices when possessing species in the snapper group or fishery management unit. And the council is looking at a couple of different alternatives here. They're looking at requiring venting devices be on board when a vessel is possessing species in the snapper group or fishery management unit. They're looking at requiring descending devices to be on board. They're also looking at requiring both venting and descending devices or requiring one or the other. And so while they're discussing this action, they'd like to get a little bit more information from the public. First being, how often are you seeing fish experiencing barotrauma? Are you familiar with venting devices and descending devices, and have you used them? And if you're not currently using them, why not? What's the reason behind your decision to not utilize these devices? Do you know of many recreational and commercial fishermen that are using these devices? And finally, should the South Atlantic Council require commercial and/or recreational fishermen to carry these devices on board when possessing snapper grouper species? And last but not least, how would you define venting device or descending device, particularly given the fact that descending devices can be constructed as opposed to purchased? The second action in this amendment looks at modifying the requirement for the use of non-stainless steel circle hooks when fishing for and/or possessing snapper grouper species with hook and line gear. Currently, non-stainless steel circle hooks are required when fishing for and/or possessing snapper grouper species with hook and line gear and natural baits north of 28 degrees north latitude, which is, if you look at the map on the slide, it's that purple line, which is about 20 miles south of Cape Canaveral. Circle hooks are required north of this purple line. And so one of the things the council's considering in this amendment is whether or not that line is at an appropriate location. It was originally set in order to avoid species where circle hooks might not have the intended beneficial effects, as well as to avoid negative social and economic impacts. And so in looking at whether or not this line is appropriate, the council could consider a number of things. They could shift the line down to where the Gulf Council requires circle hooks, which on the Atlantic side would be requiring them north of approximately Key Largo. They could also consider requiring circle hook use throughout the South Atlantic EEZ or setting the boundary at some other location. In addition to looking at where that boundary is set, they're considering requiring the use of non-offset, non-stainless steel circle hooks. Currently, regulations allow for non-offset or offset circle hooks, and they would be looking at specifying the use of non-offset, non-stainless steel circle hooks. They're also considering whether or not they should require the use of these circle hooks or simply require the hooks to be on board to give fishermen a little bit more leeway in deciding when it's not appropriate to use a circle hook. Last but not least, they could also consider removing the requirement for circle hook use when fishing for and possessing snapper grouper species. And so they're looking at this for both the commercial and/or the recreational sector. So we've got a large number of things to consider under this action. And when discussing it, again, the council would like a little input from the public. First, should the council require fishermen to use circle hooks when they're fishing for snapper grouper species? And If so, where should that circle hook boundary that we talked about be located? Should it be north of Cape Canaveral, north of Key Largo? Is there some other line, or should circle hooks be required throughout federal waters in the South Atlantic? Action 3 in this amendment looks at specifying the allowable rigs when fishing for snapper grouper species with hook and line gear in the recreational sector. And the council is looking at considering requiring the use of single hook rigs or one hook per line, and or requiring the use of a single leader. And again, the goal with this is to get fewer regulatory discards and subsequent mortality of snapper grouper species. And so the council would like input from the public on a couple of things. First, should the council specify allowable rigs for the recreational snapper grouper fishery? And second, is there a certain depth at which using single hook rigs would help avoid dead discards more so than perhaps at a different depth? And last but not least, the fourth action in this amendment looks at adjusting powerhead prohibitions in the South Atlantic. Currently, powerheads are not allowed to be used in federal waters off of South Carolina to harvest snapper grouper species, and possession of a mutilated snapper grouper species in or from federal waters off of South Carolina is considered to be evidence that the fish was harvested by a powerhead. And the council is considering two alternatives under this action. First, they could allow the use of powerheads to harvest South Atlantic snapper grouper species in federal waters off of South Carolina. Alternatively, they could prohibit the use of powerheads in federal waters throughout the South Atlantic region. And so while considering these different alternatives, the council would like input from the public on whether the council should allow powerheads to be used in federal waters off South Carolina, and where else they should or shouldn't be used throughout the South Atlantic. Now, there will be a number of opportunities for you to provide your comments on those questions I just posed, as well as this amendment as a whole. First, we're going to be holding scoping webinars, and those will be on August 7th and on August 8th, both starting at 6 p.m. I will give a presentation, after which there'll be time for some questions. Following, you'll be able to provide your comments on the record. And don't forget that registration for these webinars is required, and you can register at those two links provided on this slide. Second, if you'd like to submit written comments, you can do so using our online public comment form. Again, that link is provided here. Just note that the deadline for comments to be included in the comment overview for the September 2018 meeting is going to be August 17th at 5 p.m. If you want to stay connected with the South Atlantic Council and stay informed about all our fisheries, you can find us online. You can also follow us on Facebook or Twitter. And last but not least, if there's something that we didn't cover or you have any more questions, please feel free to contact us. If you've got questions about this particular amendment, please feel free to contact me. If you've got questions about the South Atlantic Council in general, you can contact Cameron Rhodes, our Fishery Outreach Specialist, or Kim Iverson, our Public Information Officer.